Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat wassalam ala rasulillah. Alhamdulillah kathiran. Welcome to TISA Talks. It's a series that we have periodically to inform people about activities at TISA. Today, we're talking about clinical pastoral education. We're talking about clinical pastoral education, something that many people in the Muslim community have never, ever heard about. And we have a special guest, a visiting faculty member, Chaplain Sondos Kholaki, whom I will be introducing in a few moments. But I wanted to set the table by giving you an idea of what we do at TISA, and then talk about how clinical pastoral education fits in. And Professor Sondos, who knows a lot more about clinical pastoral education than I do, will dive deeply into the subject. Okay, so what you see on the screen is our vision and our mission. That is, our vision of the Islamic Seminary of America is a world constantly bettered by religious scholarship and ethical leadership. And our mission is to cultivate generations of world-class stewards and thinkers who lead from an Islamic paradigm while engaging in contemporary challenges and opportunities. This is a vision and mission that was put together by faculty, staff, and students that connects us to our dean and also to the world. We like to say that TISA is religiously rooted, contextually relevant, and intellectually rigorous. Religiously rooted in our dean, contextually relevant to where we are in North America, and always, always intellectually rigorous. A little more about us is that there's several commitments that we have in what we do: mutual teaching and learning, academic excellence, open inquiry, and critical engagement. And we aim to graduate people with 5 core competencies. One is Quranic literacy. The second is prophetic theory and praxis. The third is cultural competence. The fourth is facilitation skills. And the fifth one is professional practice. So a little bit about how we got to where we are. We started in 2011 as an idea with about $1,500. And in 2017, through a memorandum of understanding between us and the old Islamic Seminary of America, we took over the assets, and we began operating the Islamic Seminary of America. And we had about $55,000 in assets and a $75,000 loan from Continuous Charity, brokered by United Muslim Relief. Then in 2019, we began our first classes in the fall of 2019, actually in August of 2019. And then recently in 2022, the board of directors approved our first $1 million budget, and we were approved as an affiliate of the Association of Theological Schools. More about that later on. So trying to move my PowerPoint and having a little bit of a problem. Let's move you. There you go. So our student enrollment went from about 25 to about 60 currently. We had about 1,106 applications since opening in 2019. Our student body by gender is 43% female and 57% male. Our faculty by gender, if you count all of the faculty, we do a lot of team teaching. It's about 58.49% male and 41.50% female, counting all the courses up until the end of the last term. And we're not accredited, but we are preparing for accreditation. We have a compliance committee we established in 2019. We negotiated a joint degree with the United Theological Seminary in Twin Cities for interreligious chaplaincy as a way of getting us up to speed of what kinds of things would be expected of us. As I said, we had our first $1 million budget approved recently in May, and we are affiliated of the Association of Theological Schools, which is the gold standard for accreditation for Jewish and Christian seminaries. They don't accredit Islamic seminaries, but we are an affiliate and we had to be voted on. It doesn't mean that we belong as endorsed. It just means that we're affiliated with them. We've hired an accreditation consultant, and we've hired our first full-time faculty members. Last fall, we just finished advanced Quranic studies in tafsir, spiritual formation, Islamic economics, and counseling and cross-cultural communication. Our resources acquired since starting classes, about $500,000 endowment. We've raised about $216,000 for zakat for needy students. We've given more than that out, actually, $65,000 for the Pious Salat Merit Scholarship and $197,888 for academic scholarships. We try to never turn away a student due to financial need. So quickly, institutional requirements is that if you come to the Islamic Seminary of America and take a MDiv or a Master of Arts in Islamic Studies, you have 10 required courses and 2 assessments. The assessments have no credit, but basically you have to pass Arabic proficiency at what we call either a level 2 or level 4, as assessed by Kholaki, assessment tool. You have to pass the memorization of 1 juz of Quran with tajweed that is supervised by our faculty. And what makes us different, as I said before, we're religiously rooted, contextually relevant, intellectually rigorous, and we focus on the student experience, and we run by a sure process, and we make things go by forming partnerships, the synergy of partnerships. So the core courses are advanced Quranic studies, advanced hadith, advanced aqidah, comparative religion interface involvement, advanced fiqh al-ibadat, fiqh al-muamalat on the family, advanced akhlaq and spirituality, contemporary issues in the Muslim Ummah, which encompasses many things, Islam in America, and the history of Islamic civilization and cultures. So we have a Master of Arts in Islamic Studies, and we have 2 concentrations, Islamic Sciences, Islamic Leadership. They're the same 10 required courses that we talked about. Everybody has to take them. And the 2 assessments everybody has to take. And then we have 2 required courses and 4 electives, Advanced Sirah, Evolution of Islamic Law, and Usul al-Fiqh. And then they choose from a list of courses. In the MA in Islamic Studies for Islamic Leadership concentration, they have counseling, cross-cultural communication, Foundation of Effective Organizational Leadership, Imam and Chaplain functions as required courses, and 3 electives that come from this list. You can find all of this at islamicseminary.us on our website. We have the MDiv program, which is our concern today because it's in the MDiv program where people take clinical pastoral education. We have 2 concentrations, religious leadership and Islamic chaplaincy. For both concentrations, there are 10 required courses, again, 30 credit hours, and those 2 assessments, Quran and Arabic that you mentioned before. There are also required courses for both tracks of the MDiv, which are a number of courses that we mentioned before. You can see them here, right? But they include, down at the bottom, clinical pastoral education, 1 and 2, which we'll be talking about tonight. If you're taking a master's in religious leadership with us, you have 2 required courses and 3 electives. And these, again, courses we mentioned before. And again, you can find all this detail on our website. And here are the electives for the Master of Divinity in Religious Leadership concentration. Again, you go to islamicseminary.us, you go to academics, and you click on degrees, and you'll find this detail. And then there's an Islamic chaplaincy concentration. Again, the same required 10 courses and Quran and Arabic proficiency. And then there are different required courses than the Islamic leadership MDiv requires. And then there's electives. Again, you can go to our website and you can look at these electives. And then that's us. And if you wanted to reach out to us, our phone number is 214-484-1309, 214-484-1309. So that's a little bit about us. So we're going to turn to our Professor Sondos, who's also a chaplain herself. Chaplain Sondos serves as a hospital and staff chaplain and volunteer police and community chaplain in Southern California. She is board certified with the Association of Professional Chaplains, and Sondos earned a Master Divinity degree in Islamic chaplaincy at Bayan Islamic Graduate School. Sondos is the author of the award-winning book, Musings of a Muslim Chaplain, published in 2020, and is a co-editor of an anthology, a groundbreaking anthology, I would indicate, which includes another faculty member, Professor Omar Bajwa, Mantle of Mercy, Islamic Chaplaincy in North America. And without further ado, we'll introduce Chaplain Professor Sondos, who will talk some about her work in clinical pastoral education.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Just again, thank you to Professor Jones and the whole team at TISA for having me tonight. Just to provide this brief overview of CPE and the program. So a little bit of the background between me and CPE. I completed my CPE units between the years 2016 and 2017. I basically began my first unit of CPE, which I'll talk about what that means, as an intern, really not having any idea what I was getting myself into. I just went in because it was a part of my MDiv degree and I knew I had to do it. And subhanAllah, Allah made it so that I was doing it in the middle of my studies. But from the first week, I really loved the work so much that I applied for 4 more units eventually, and applied for residency, which meant that I was a paid student, essentially part employee and part student. And the residency, my CPE residency, is what led me into my eventual employment. And that's what I remain doing to this day, alhamdulillah, still serving at the same hospital. So CPE was incredibly formative for me, both personally and professionally. And I don't know how I could serve as a chaplain today without having had that seminal training, which is what, why I'm very passionate about this. So let's start at the very beginning. CPE stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. It's essentially an educational program where students learn through hands-on experience. So there's a small group, a small cohort with a supervisor, and the learning takes place within that group setting. So who is CPE for, or who is best suited to go into this program? I would say anybody who is involved in any sort of pastoral care capacity. In other words, if you are seen by community members in any way, shape, or form as a spiritual or religious leader, I really highly recommend that you do at least 1 unit of CPE, especially chaplains, especially imams. And if it were up to me, I would say every single person in the world should do at least a unit of CPE, and I think the world would be slightly better off. And you'll probably see why as I go on in my presentation. So in CPE, the CPE student is learning skills on how to provide spiritual care to care seekers, who is the direct person who's in need. Depending on the context in the hospital, that's a patient, for example, the family of the care seeker, and or the staff at the institution where you're serving, which is usually multi-faith. So settings would look like usually a hospital or healthcare setting like hospice, but it's also beginning to expand to include secular institutions such as companies and within faith communities itself. And I know that TISA and was it JTS has a special relationship for CPE, Dr. Jones?
Jewish Theological Seminary, correct.
Jewish Theological Seminary, right. So we can talk a little bit about how that works. When I was talking about units of CPE, the program is divided into what they call units, and essentially 1 unit of CPE equals 400 hours, of 100 of them being like actual education, and 300 of those hours, give or take, of direct clinical experience. And that's with the chaplain student or the imam student, the CPE student sitting directly with the care seeker. And having those encounters. So some programs, CPE programs, offer this full time. So it would look like for 400 hours, that would be 40 hours a week for 10 weeks, for example. Other units offer a half unit of CPE, where perhaps you're doing 20 hours a week over a longer period. And I know of other CPE programs that are very sympathetic to those who are working full-time, for example, or have families or other circumstances that don't allow for them to take on another full-time commitment, where they offer less than half units, very flexible scheduling over a much longer period of time. So depending on which program you can look into, they might offer some flexibility around this. 4 CPE units, or 1,600 hours, is what is required eventually for board certification as a chaplain, which I'll cover shortly, inshallah. So when we look at that 400 hours, we talked about, at least 100 hours of it being structured or supervised education. And that looks like a small group setting. Ideally, and most likely, it will be multi-faith. So the student cohort will be of different faiths. You'll have Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, whoever else might be thrown into the mix. A good CPE program will try and keep it as diverse as possible so that we can learn from each other. And there will be a CPE supervisor or educator who is leading the learning there. The structured and supervised educational part of it looks like didactics or presentations by people on selected topics. My favorite part of it was the case studies or the verbatims, which is a case study that is brought in by chaplain or CPE students of a clinical encounter with a care seeker verbatim, which is exactly what it sounds like. Chaplain said this, student said this, and the care seeker said this, and then the chaplain said this, and then so on. And that's ultimately dissected in the peer group with the supervisor to really scrutinize and look at the conversation, to look at ways that it could be improved, and most importantly, to delve deeply into the student's own inner workings during that encounter. In other words, not only are you reporting back to the group what was said, but also what you were thinking at the time and what you were feeling at the time. So it really is about a really close look at oneself inwardly. And so this is done, and then there are seminars and individual mentorship. So you're not, left alone in the middle of the ocean. You have weekly meetings with your supervisor where you can process through really difficult cases or encounters or misgivings or doubts or whatever it is. And there's also peer and group mentorship as well. CPE is known best for its action and reflection process, and especially through these case studies. And as I described the verbatim or the case study, I hope it's reminding you of something that's perhaps been brought up in our own tradition of Islam, which is this idea of muraqaba and muhasaba, this idea of self-observation or looking at oneself, one's behaviors, feelings, thoughts, and muhasaba and self-accountability, right? Holding oneself accountable. So CPE is a lot of self-assessment tools, learning about our own sources of pain, our own sources of loss. And I really see this embodying this learning from our tradition of he who knows himself best knows his Lord. So the more that we know ourselves, the more that we know our shortcomings, our weaknesses, our strengths, what is our spiritual love language, how best do we connect to people, how best do we connect to God, that fuels our stronger connection, inshallah, with our faith and with Allah. So you think you're going into CPE a lot of times to help other people, but what it's really about at the end of it is really unearthing the darkness within us, examining the source of it and extinguishing it using the light from the tools that we learn from our theological reflection. So that's about 100 hours is a supervised education content that's coming at you. Then we have this about 300 hours of clinical encounters, direct clinical encounters with care seekers. So we learn how to best accompany those who are in crisis. How do we assess for sources of distress? How do we intervene then? And what do we look for in terms of outcomes? Most importantly in CPE, especially in the first unit, you learn the art of active listening and presence, of hudur. And you think you know how to listen actively until you get into CPE, and then you unlearn everything you thought you knew and learn a brand new set of tools that, inshallah, will benefit you not only professionally, but also personally in personal relationships. So very quickly, the origins of CPE are traced back to Anton Boysen, who in around 1925 held the first cohort of CPE students. And he was a professor at a seminary who was also admitted to the mental institution or mental hospital himself for schizophrenia and other cases that came up for him. And he realized while he was there, while talking to the other patients, that there was a theme of feeling disconnected spiritually, and that he himself went through a lot of spiritual distress. So he began thinking, well, why don't I take the students in the seminary who are studying theology and studying these texts and put them in the hospital and have them actually sit with patients and kind of put the theory into practice and into application. And he started seeing this bridge between the two spaces. In our tradition, we have this idea of not only reading and analyzing the text or the sudur, like the lines in text, but also what's in the sudur, in the chest, which is the heart. And so Anton Boysen coined this term of the living human document, where essentially, just as you respect the study of a text and you spend time with it and you analyze it and you read it and you try to really understand it, that we give the same due diligence and the same respect and honor to the person who's sitting right in front of us, who is a text in and of themselves, where the story continues to unfold. And he says, he advocated for seminarians to fulfill a clinical term where they learn about religion and spirituality by sitting with the sick. And that immediately prompted in me, reminded me of the hadith of our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who talked about this hadith Qudsi, right? Where Allah is having this conversation, God is having this conversation, says, "O child of Adam, I became sick and you did not visit me." And the person will say, "O Lord, how can I visit you? And you are the Lord of all the worlds." And God will reply, Did you not know that my slave so-and-so became sick and you did not visit him? Did you not know that if you visited him, you would have found me with him? So this idea of visiting the sick being our duty, finding something sacred in that space, which I've found over and over again to be absolutely true. So when we go back to the types of learning that are present in CPE, we're learning a lot about crisis and trauma, how to work through that with people, accompanying people. We're learning the art of pastoral counseling, learning a lot about end of life and bereavement support, especially in my context in the hospital, about prayer. How do you pray with people of your faith, with other faiths? How do you facilitate that for people where, they need certain rituals that perhaps you cannot facilitate yourself, or maybe you do? Patient advocacy. How do you support staff who are taking, like, the caretakers of those who are in need of care? And on the other side of it, you're also learning how to become a professional, like a professional employee as part of an institution, as part of a bigger system. So in the hospital, for example, a chaplain is considered part of the interdisciplinary team of the well-being or holistic care of the patient, right? We are a part of that puzzle. You are learning how to have dialogue and interact with people from different faiths and also no faiths at all. You're also in CPE learning a lot of cultural and ethical competence and a lot of humility, because we go in thinking that we know something, and when it's put to the test, we realize we don't really know much at all. So how to apply? It really is, the first step is to go to acpe.edu. This is the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. And the first thing you do is try to find a program that is accredited by ACPE in your area. So I think you can put in your zip code or your state. There's also the program at JTS that you can find out more about by Dr. Jones, if that's something that you prefer to do virtually, where you don't have to actually go in person if you have limited time and resources. So research the programs, research the fees, the requirements, the schedule, Remember, I talked about what kinds of units are offered for different programs. Some programs are more flexible than others. Call up the program and ask about availability and whatnot. Then when you decide on the program that works for you, you complete the application on the CPE website. You send that directly to the program. And there is an application fee that you want to note if you're doing this for a local program for yourself. And there will be an interview as well, most likely. And I will just say that some centers do fill up like 6 to 12 months in advance, and there could be a waiting list. So definitely apply early, even if you're not intending to do CPE maybe this year or later on of this year, but maybe next year. Still start to research that and look into it. The application is a little bit hefty too. There's a lot of writing and whatnot. And just really, really quickly, I want to say just a few notes, having been through the process and having, both challenges and opportunities come out of it. The three maybe suggestions or offerings that I could give you of how to feel like you did CPE successfully. And the first one is really to go into it with this attitude of learning and curiosity. Again, this deep humility that we're going into it, really unlearning a lot and learning what is probably better on top of that. This is a classroom. Don't ever forget that this is an educational program. It is hands-on, it is experiential, but at the end of the day, the whole point of it is that we are there to learn. We're not coming into it knowing everything, and it's okay if you don't. It's okay to make that mistake. It's okay to learn from it. This is the space to be able to do that. The second one, and the one that I stress the most for anybody who asks me about CPE, is please be sure to have a support group. For me, the support group really came through the Association of Muslim Chaplains, or AMC, where we have a cohort and a support group dedicated to Muslims who are in CPE programs together at the same time, maybe not at the same location. Across the nation, they're in different states and they're doing the same thing. We have a group for them to be able to process and discuss and come up with things together. That was a really big part of it. And then the mentorship also I found at my own seminary in Bayan. And I recommend for those enrolled in TISA, if you have professors, teachers, make sure that you have people who are there to guide you into when those really heavy questions come up, which eventually and inevitably they will in CPE, with the level of encounters and crisis that you will see there and experience. Really, really important to have the right people guiding you towards the right answers that work for you. And the last thing I'll say is that if you really start to approach CPE with this intention of worship, because I really see CPE as that, it really is a form of tazkiyah, or this self kind of purification process. Because through learning about yourself, again, you're learning about ways to connect with people, but also, and even more importantly, learning ways to connect with Allah Ta'ala. This is how we get closer to Allah and His Messenger, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this is what I found, and really just going quickly over these core competencies. My connection to my faith and to Allah Ta'ala deepened considerably out of CPE. Because I'll share very candidly that I felt very jealous of my peer group, that I was the only Muslim in my CPE cohort. And in my cohort, there was a Buddhist, there were Christians, of course, and Catholics, and they all seemed to be able to come up, with stories and with verses from their scripture very easily that connected to an encounter or case study that they had in the hospital. And I wondered, why didn't I have that? Like, what was lacking in my years of Islamic studies where I couldn't come up with a story of how the Prophet ﷺ accompanied somebody who was in crisis, just off the top of my head. And so out of this experience and with the lack of books and texts and literature on Islamic chaplaincy or Islamic spiritual care, I began putting together my own resources. And that's where my book came out of. It was all out of CPE and me trying to process that experience for myself. That's why we published Untitled Mercy, because that was the text that I wish I had when I was in CPE. So in other words, these core competencies that are listed for TISA students and for those who eventually are seeking endorsement are really, really, really important. And these are going to really come through for you in CPE. It was in CPE that I learned that I began to put together my own database of verses of the Quran that had anything to do with spiritual care and chaplaincy. I started my own Excel sheet about that. So that meant I had to crack open the Quran and really spend time with it to see, where is chaplaincy in all of this? What does the Quran say? What does Allah Ta'ala teach me about pastoral care and being with people? And reading it from that angle, and really like that education process, right, for myself, because I didn't have those readily available. Prophetic theory and praxis, again, I remember putting out all of the books that I had on Sirah and the biography of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, and rereading them with the lens of chaplaincy and everything I was learning in CPE, all of these tools that were coming up for me, like, was this something that the Prophet Muhammad SAW used himself? If so, how did he do it? And how can I begin to inculcate that in my own practice? If he didn't do it, what did he do instead? All of these questions that were coming up for me. So being able to apply, right, the biography of the Prophet ﷺ and his life and sunnah into our actual ministry and practice became really important. Cross-cultural capability, as I mentioned, we're working with Muslims and people of other faiths or no faiths at all, learning how to dialogue with them, learning how they define spirituality and religion, facilitation skills. As I was talking about, the case study and the verbatim helps a lot with this, beginning to understand how to counsel. What does counseling people mean as a chaplain? It doesn't actually mean what you think it means in the very beginning, right? And how do we connect with people? Connection before correction, right? All of these skills that we're learning. And then finally, this idea of integrating as a professional discipline into the institution. And so as I talked about, learning how to work with other members of staff, learning how you fit into the institution as a chaplain, you're learning your pastoral authority and your role and your function alongside everybody else who's doing their job. And for my last slide, just really quickly to know, I mentioned earlier about board certification. And so if you see here, this is taken from the Association of Professional Chaplains, or APC. This is one certifying body. I believe another one is the Spiritual Care Association. This is the process that I went through, though, with APC. So this is the one that I'm most familiar with. But they did require for a full certification, board certification, 4 units, again, of CPE. You really need as many for the application. The application is a beast for board certification. It took me an entire year to complete. I was doing it, at my own pace, but the more experience and the more encounters that I had, the better I was able to answer those competency essays and questions, because I was able to weave in actual case examples. So the more, the better. And why become board certified? And I'll end with this. Not only does it provide a sense of job security, because when you have that BCC, board certified chaplain, after your name, what it tells the institution of employment is that you've met the national standards for professionalism. You are accountable to this body of professional chaplains, right? You're held to a code of ethics. In other words, you have continued professional growth, because every year we have to submit proof of 50 hours of continued education, at least in different areas. But the most important one, and this is what was advised for me by Chaplain Suhaib Sultan, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah have mercy on his soul, who was the first chaplain who I met and was the person who inspired me to go into chaplaincy. May Allah count it for him as under his rewards and sadaqah jariyah. Ameen. But when he outlined for me the path and said, Sondos, you do your MDiv. And I had no idea there was actual path for chaplaincy, by the way. I thought he was making this up. He said, you do the MDiv in your chaplaincy. You do your CPE. And then you go to board certification. And I said, do I have to do the board certification part, like in order to get a job? And he said, not necessarily, but you owe it to our community to be the best at chaplaincy. So this concept that he was referring to of ihsan, or excellence, that's a part and parcel of our tradition. Like, why stop at the bare minimum when you can get the gold standard? Just like, Dr. Jones was talking about being affiliated with a group that is the gold standard. Board certification is the top. And as Muslim chaplains, why not go for the most training, the most education, the best skills that we can maybe inshallah get for ourselves, because our community deserves that. Our community deserves pastoral care by the best of the best, inshallah. So I pray that Allah grants us success and ease on our journeys to better ourselves and to serve Him by serving His beloved creation. And again, I thank Dr. Jones and everybody at TISA and all those listening for allowing me to present. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Excellent, excellent presentation. We're open to questions. Staff are monitoring both YouTube and Facebook, and so we'll look for them in the chat. But I want to talk to Professor Sondos about her presentation a bit and put in some of my experiences. The first point is that I think what's clear from your presentation is that to do CPA takes a very large commitment, right? It takes a large commitment of time. 400 hours per unit is a lot of time, particularly for the kind of people who might be watching who are very busy. It takes your talent in the sense that you're going to be contributing to the life of an institution. You're not just going to be learning. You're going to be contributing to the life of an institution. You're going to actually serve on the front line. If you're in healthcare, particularly during COVID, right? You know, if you're talking about the first responders, chaplains were first responders and dealing with some of the same stresses. And then finally, this costs money. Right? That my wife did 4 units, but I noticed that most of the people in her cohort, she did a residency at Yale New Haven Hospital. Most people in her cohort had traveled from someplace else in order to do it, which means that they relocated in order to do that. And if I'm not mistaken, that is the model, that people look around the country if they want to do CPE and they try to get in, and there are a limited number of spaces. Is all that I said correct, Professor?
Correct. That is correct.
So people should understand it. On the other hand, one of the things that you said is that this is necessary for us to do. Now, I know there are people who've come to our conferences in the past and talked about this is too Christian-centric, we're using Christian terminology, why are we using chaplaincy? The reality is, I'll say to you the same thing I say to my students. If you want to create a new pathway, you need to learn the old one. In other words, there are other people who've done this. Before we opened our doors at TISA, we went to Al-Azhar, we went to Yale University, we went to Union Theological Seminary in NYC, we went to Jewish Theological Seminary. Before we even opened our doors, we sat down with Yale Divinity School, we sat down with Howard University School of Divinity. We literally sat down and picked their brains before we opened our doors, because we had never done this before. And that one of the things that we're trying to do is to be the best, as Professor Sondos said. And as a person who's been a volunteer prison chaplain for more than 30 years, and a community chaplain who works primarily with families for the past 2 or 3 decades, this is much needed in our community. It's a major investment, but it's much needed. And everybody can't do it, and everybody's not suited for it. You might add, right? Everybody's not suited for it. But the people who can, they should, because we need to up our game professionally. Right?
Agreed.
Yeah.
There are definitely obstacles, and why a lot of people make excuses not to do CPE. Time is a huge one, and I completely understand that. It could be fear of hospitals, fear of death, fear of the unknown. Multi-faith setting might make people really uncomfortable if you've only been really used to serving, a Muslim community. So maybe being plunged into a multi-faith context might be out of your comfort zone. There are a lot of excuses that we can make for a lot of things, but I think Dr. Jones, you say it well. This is something that we have to do, and I'm really glad that this is a requirement of the MDiv program, because it is just as important as tafsir and hadith studies and all of these things. It goes back to this idea of we read texts, but we also need to sit with human beings and be able to understand What is it that they draw from? How are they comforted? What are the rituals and the practices and the beliefs that really inform the way that they see the world? And how are they making meaning out of the crisis and the hardship that they're going through? And CPE is not about us learning so that we can give the answer to somebody else, but it really is about learning the tools and the ways that people come to these beliefs and these practices that will A, strengthen our own foundation, and B, help us to kind of assess the way forward for somebody and help accompany them.
Yeah, I often say to people, Muslims in particular, that we as Muslims in North America have 3 tasks. One is to reconnect to our usul, because we're a little bit adrift, in my view. We give lip service to, or we don't go to our primary sources. The second is to reclaim the moral and intellectual high ground. Now, how this relates to what we're talking about is that a lot of the things that we think about having being alien to Islam really, and this is, you make this point, writers in Mantle of Mercy make this point, but Professor Rania Awad, who is another one of our visiting faculty, makes this point that much of what people call psychology today, much of what they call best practices today, it was the Muslims who emphasized the whole person, for instance, because there's a lot of talk about a whole person. And even the name Maristan comes from this concept, where she's the executive director. And so the point is that the first thing, reconnect to our usul. The second is reclaim the intellectual, reclaim it, because we've had it. I mean, we had it in Andalus, we had it in other civilizations. We have to reclaim the intellectual and the moral high ground, right? And then we have to recalibrate. And that's why I think the recalibration is about understanding this place and this time and this context. And if you're going to work in a hospital in the United States, you're going to have to and have a real job as a chaplain. You're going to have to do CPE, right, Professor Sondos?
100%.
Yes. Yeah. Let's see. Still no questions. All right. So we're going to begin to wrap up. Why don't you talk for a moment about, as we wrap up, what's the most important takeaway for your experience? You talked about a lot of in terms of, and maybe I'll just talk a little bit about, give that last pitch to why people should do it both inside or outside of TISA. So what do you think is the most important takeaway from your perspective?
My last slide, and I didn't put it up just for the sake of time, but it really was naming these possible obstacles that I hear from people who are nervous about going to CPE, and some who, frankly, chaplains themselves who did a unit of CPE and said, just as you said, Dr. Jones, this is not for me. Knew immediately that the hospital was not the setting that they wanted to be in, really struggled to finish that first unit, that one unit, and they were like, no more, that was it. But that's okay. Do at least the one unit. And yes, it might be uncomfortable. And all those obstacles that we named, whether it's time or other full-time commitments, fear of the unknown, of hospitals, of different settings, of being in a multi-faith setting, not sure how it's going to be, all of those have solutions to it. For the time one, just as you mentioned, the JTS option is something that is flexible. I know programs here in Southern California that offer these things like half units at a time, or just doing maybe 8 hours a week or even less, but over a very much longer period of time, right? Like, talk to the supervisor. And the takeaway that I would say is that you're kind of a special unicorn in this whole world, because there aren't many Muslims still applying to CPE programs. And to diversify the group, if I were a CPE educator, I would put you right at the top as somebody who I would want as part of that dialogue and that cohort. So I feel like Muslims have the upper hand in this still, because we're not really large in numbers, and a lot of CPE programs see our presence as a benefit to their program, which is wonderful and amazing. So time, inshallah, find the program that is right for you. Call around, look around, be serious about this. I did this, alhamdulillah, I was able to do it with the help of Allah at 40 hours a week as a resident. I have kids, I have a husband, a family. I was still enrolled in my MDiv program. And Allah made it work somehow, but also my supervisor was very, very helpful and flexible. And that was a big, big relief for me, alhamdulillah. And I'll close with this to say, remember your intention going into it. That every second, every minute that you spend is for worship. And when I say worship, when our purpose, Allah describes it to us as worshiping Him, you know, a lot of the commentators will say that we worship Him by serving Him and by serving His creation. And that's really what you're doing in CPE. All of these ahadith about the benefits of being with people who are sick, or being with people who are sick, maybe just not physically, but who are emotionally sick, who are spiritually sick. These all fall under that category. How many ahadith about the mercy and the blessings and the angels who come as your entourage when you're doing that. And I promise you, you will feel the blessings and you will feel that mercy be just infused in your life. Ever since I started this job, it has just really opened my eyes, opened my heart, enhanced, enriched my connection, my faith, my understanding of faith, and just really that mercy of Allah has been so, so, so palpable. It's a beautiful experience. It's difficult. It's challenging. It will stretch you, and that's all good. We all need that. And inshallah, you will come away with many, many skills and be able to benefit those who are in need and who honor you by coming to you with those needs.
So I think the other point to make here is that CPE is not just for hospitals, even though hospitals require it and you can get a job as a chaplain without it. But the reality is that when we look at the situation in terms of our leadership of our Islamic centers and our nonprofits, when it comes to skills that CPE talks about being present, letting people sit in their mess, listening to people. You know, we know that the Prophet ﷺ was called all ear, and we forget these things and we forget these connections. And so, as you pointed out, the 5 core competencies are very important. The first 2 are particularly important: Quranic literacy, prophetic theory, and praxis. But then you talk about cross-cultural. I mean, we know that the Prophet ﷺ, his first community was cross-cultural. We would call it multicultural. And facilitation skills, that's what CPE is. Learning about self and others and how you integrate self with others in very, very, in your case, in very, very difficult times. But in my case as well, as a community chaplain, I run into extremely, extremely difficult times. And even you, if it sounds daunting to you, as Professor Sondos pointed out, there are different kinds of programs that are experimenting. As a matter of fact, one of the ways I learned about CPE, aside from my wife being in it, I was a CPE field supervisor for somebody going through, because you can take part of it in the community. This person was doing part in Yale New Haven Hospital and part at Masjid al-Islam, and I was a field supervisor. And so it's not totally disconnected from your reality. You're going to find programs who do this kind of thing. And finally, for those who want to do an MDiv, I mean, of course, we included it in our MDiv simply because, particularly for hospital chaplaincy, CPE is the gold standard. I mean, you're not going to get a serious job. You might get the volunteer, and you might be able to be a contractor, but you're not going to get a serious job at a hospital in the United States, because hospitals are all about standards. And so they're not going to just let you walk in. You might be able to be a prison chaplain, like I walked in many years ago without any really background, but you're not going to walk into the hospital like that. And that's where the real jobs are. And finally, if we're going to root ourselves here, in this place, in this time, and make a difference here, then we ought to know what's going on here that's beneficial to all people. We should be beneficial to all people. We should want to know. And so, again, think about it in 2 ways. One, as something you might do as a standalone to increase your skills, and particularly if you want to work in a hospital setting. And also, if you're going to take a Master's Divinity with us, you're going to have to do the 400 hours of CPE, plus another 400 hours of field placement in an Islamic center or a nonprofit. So these are requirements. But alhamdulillah, our intention is to enhance our leadership, build standards, and make for a better Muslim community in this world, right? And also in the United States, in the world, And whole point is having discussion with someone before, is that the reality is that only Allah Ta'ala is in charge of what goes on here. I just want to be on the right side, because I don't, institutions come and go, and what I'm interested in comes and go. But the bottom line is that I'm trying to be pleasing to Allah Ta'ala. And I know by serving, this is the point of mantle of mercy. I know by service that inshallah, on Yom Kippur, this will count. So I want to thank you for tuning into this edition of TISA Talks. It'll be posted on YouTube, I'm sure, and you can tell people about it. Quite frankly, it's the most, I've been around CPE for several years, but I learned a lot from listening to Professor Sondos, because she really dug into it and she gave you a good idea of it. And of course, if you're interested in the Islamic Seminary of America, you can find us at islamicseminary.us. And we'd love to talk to you about either taking a degree with us, or we have non-credit courses, we have certificate courses. We're all in this together to try to make us stronger in this place and this time, and be a benefit to the Muslim community, to the world. And inshallah, Allah Ta'ala will join us together in the hereafter. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wal ars inna l'insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And we are